let's see if we can finish this then. We're on about page 160, setting the default preference values and registering a change listener. Remember, this is something that you learned back in advanced Java, that anytime you want to be able to react to anything, in this case button clicks, all right, you're going to have some kind of a listing event that you're going to have to register, and you're going to have to write code for it. And typically the way it's done most often in Java is to have an anonymous inner class, and that's what they talk about in this section right here. All that I've read is that's considered to be the standard way, and that's pulled over from Java. All right, because that's how it's done in Java. You don't have to do it like that in Java either. You don't have to do it like that, but that's just, you know how stuff gets. Somebody does it, somebody else says that's not bad, and pretty soon everybody's doing it. All right, that's the best I can tell you. All right, but it's funny. It's because like when you talk, you didn't ask this, but like if with Swift, I go out there and I'm looking all the time, and people are asking for standards. They haven't adopted them yet. All right, because there's a lot of people that. I was out watching this. I think I told you guys about this. I was out watching this video. And this guy, he's naming everything. You'd think he was in Visual Studio. His text boxes are TXT. You know, his buttons are BTN. Everything is like that. And you know, he even says in his video, he says, "Well, there aren't any Swift standards yet, so I'm just going to name them the way I do for most projects that I do." There's nothing wrong with that. I think he called it the Travis Baker method. I believe he did. What was that? Wait. What you said? No, he didn't. He spelled it all right, but he used the wrong caseness all the time. He used reverse camel caseness. He used the camel in a vertical as opposed to a horizontal position. That's all right. Again, as it says in here, lines 47 to 53 in here determine whether that it's running on a tablet or it's running on a phone. We already looked at that code, okay? All right, on start. Notice here it says on start is going to be called 2 different times. All right, when the app first executes, on start's called after on create. When the app is running in portrait mode and the user opens up the settings activity. So again, the idea is they may want to be making a change to one of the options in there. The number of buttons or the countries or whatever that are being shown. Okay? All right. And we talked about this a little bit before. When you work with some of this stuff, the at least with part of it, the hardest thing is getting to know every single one of the parameters that are involved and what they mean. All right, when you look at this more often than not, you end up, when you're in doubt, you use this. Okay. It says, in this app, we want to show the menu only when the app is running in portrait orientation. All right, so it says lines 87 and 88 use the window manager to get the screen's current width and height based on that, on that device's orientation. So that's how they're figuring it out. And they use the very simple formula: if your height is greater than your width, you're in portrait. If your width is greater than your height, you're in landscape. That's about the simplest formula I could think of. All right, so well, what happens if you're both? Or what if they're equal? All right. Yeah, but the way I looked at it is, if that's the case, that's almost the way it is when you're in an iPad, because iPads are almost square. All right, they're a lot more square than these are. All right, I think they are at least. All right. As it says here, some of these are very, pretty small methods. It's called when the menu item is selected. In this app, the default menu is provided by the IDE. So we talked about this before. It's just got the word settings. And then they go and they add the other stuff to it. So they keep it simple. You don't have to do that. But I think since this is his first time going into the idea of writing menus, he tried to keep it as simple as possible. All right. This is that intent that he's putting in there, where basically he is going to be telling it that he wants it to stop for 2 seconds, and then to show the next flag. All right. Here's that anonymous inner class that we talked about before. When a change occurs, method onShared preference change sets preference change to true. In other words, what they want to immediately do is if you change either the countries being shown or the number of buttons or both, they want to, boom, they want that to immediately be reflected. Okay? So they say that changes, this preference change is equal to true. But as soon as they do that, then they check to see if it's just been changed. And if they changed it, they set it back again to false. And they mention all that in here. All right. This is where he comes in, and you'll notice he uses that set string right in there. All right. I understand what he's doing. If you said, could you explain it in depth? Not a bit. All right. And even watching that tape, no. But it does make some sense as to what he's doing and how he's doing it. But again, as I've said before, these people, and Gaddis does the same thing. Yes. What he's asking here is, did you change the choices or did you change the regions? And literally, you can't change them both at the same time. You know what I mean? You change one, because it only shows one screen of them at a time. All right? So you click OK, and then you bring it up again, and you could change the other one. All right? That's basically what he's accounting for in here. And he puts his little toast there's his toast. Okay, quiz will restart with your new settings. That's it. As mentioned on the bottom of page 164 and going on, it says this builds the flag quiz's GUI and implements the quiz's logic. So again, as always, he shows you the new packages that you're importing into the program. All right. Talks about the fields that are in here. Anybody remember this? We talked about this before. We've talked about tags. This isn't the same thing, though. I mentioned tags in some of the other classes, that a tag can be most programming languages allow for a special field that you'll see inside of your properties window that's called tag. And tag is typically an integer that you can use to uniquely identify that particular one. That's not this. No, all I'm saying is what he's doing here, as he says, this is the string used when logging error messages. This is kind of cool with some of the stuff that he's going to do for the rest of the chapter. All right? Because what he's saying is when stuff goes wrong, it would be nice to come up with some kind of an error message that was reflective of what's going wrong. So he'll get into that in just a couple minutes, and they're system messages, but then he starts to ferret out what he doesn't want to see. So he's only showing what he does want to see. No, this is just going to be a string. This is just going to be a string that's called flag quiz activity. That's all. But I didn't want people to look at that and think, what the, The stuff that's happening in here, and again, I'm not running through this right now, but in this quiz fragment, it's figuring out, did you get the answer right? How many questions have you done? How many have you gotten right? How many have you gotten wrong? So it's accumulating the statistics for the game. If you call it a game or whatever you want to call it, that's what's happening in here. It's also making sure, as it says, it's going to randomly pick the flags that are going to be included in the quiz. All right? And very important when you do that, again, as we talked about, that you want to make sure that you're somehow seeding the rand. Because if there's 50 flags, you don't want the same 10 showing all the time. All right? And he goes through the shake animation. Have you noticed a lot of the stuff that's going on in here All right, are people getting at least familiar, comfortable with what that means? That you've got all this stuff, as Mark talked about before, what if you created it all in XML? Well, the act of taking all that stuff that we have basically, for example, in here and converting it into its equivalent Java is what's happening during that inflation process. All right, and that's what he's talking about. I mean, that's making it pretty simple, but really that is what he's talking about. All right, the layout resource ID indicating the layout to inflate, the layout object, and a Boolean indicating whether or not the GUI needs to be attached to the view group. Again, when you look in here, all right, so the fragment quiz, container, and I think that's a standard word, and just the Boolean. This he already went over the stuff in here as far as what's going on with the shake animation. All right. Now notice what he's got in here. Looks a little different from some of the stuff that we've seen before. 0, 1, and 2. He's grabbing the whole row of buttons at a time. Again, because he's saying there's nothing, for lack of better words, those buttons are just placeholders. And ideally, hopefully this makes sense to everybody in here, but ideally if I'm running this program, all right, let's get it back to where it was. So if I'm running it here, and let's just assume that I ran this, and now it's coming up 5 times later and this same flag comes up. These shouldn't necessarily be in the same order. Does that make sense to everyone? That's the other thing that he's doing. So you might say, oh, I remember that flag. Yeah, it was the one on the left. All right, as opposed to remembering what that flag, the name of was on the button. And that's what he's trying to do. So he's trying to, I think at least as much as possible, he's trying to come in and he's trying to bring some randomness to the game. All right. This is, we talked about this before. He's going to come in here, maybe I'm a little early. Nope, these are the listeners. So that, he's randomizing the, he's randomizing the flags first, and then he's randomizing the choices are going to be, however the choices are set up in there, but he's randomizing the order in which those choices are going to appear. Yes. Yes. Again, he talks about the shake animation. Update guess rows. Well, what does that mean? That means that that every single time that you come in here and update the guest rows based on the value and shared preferences. Get the number of guest buttons that should be displayed. All right. So how many of you asked for? 1, 2, or 3, and he's going to give you 3, 6, or 9 based on that. Then he sets everything, I mentioned this before, he sets everything in here to invisible. Then he comes back and he says, okay, for only those that basically, he looks at the setting and he sees whether or not the setting, whether it's set to 3, 6, or 9. And that 3, 6, or 9 is going to equate to 0, 1, or 2. All right, because the first one is setting 0, the second one is setting 1, the third one is setting 2, which is why I believe he's doing the division by 3 there. So it says update regions is called each time when the app is launched and each time the user changes the world regions. Okay, we talked about that before. Resetting the quiz, we talked about that before. This is, I mentioned this to you before. What he wants to do is this. So if I come through here, I go back into here, go to settings, choose regions, and I uncheck everything. And I say OK. All right, it says regions to include. Quiz will start. And right now there's nothing set, right? So I come back in here and I want to tell it to restart. Well, I thought maybe I was wrong, unless it didn't reset it. It is North America. See that? It did that for us by default. That's what he's showing. All right. I guess the country that came up just surprised me. Must be. Well, again, depending on where you were doing this for, what country you were doing this for, you probably would end up changing that default region, I should say. All right, the load next flag here on page 171, we've talked about this before. And what that one is going to do is it's going to display the next flag, but remember, when it does that, what does it have to do? Well, we have to make sure that we've already flagged the last answer, all right, is either right or wrong. Go on, we've got our 2-second thing that we have to fill up. We've got to put in a new flag, and we've got to put in new buttons. And that's what he's talking about here. You only load a new flag when you've guessed correctly. Yes, at least one. Yes, yes. And if you guessed correct on the first one, so if you know your geography, yeah, you'd have one. But yes, yes. Well, yeah. The way and again, remember too the way he set this up that eventually you don't go on. So you really could change the logic in here that you get one guess, and if you get it wrong, it's just flagged as being incorrect. You could do that. You'd have to do some work on here, but you could do that. On the bottom of 173 here, he talks about the anonymous inner class that implements the on-click listener. All right, again, that handles the guess button for each one. You've already seen that. As soon as you guess, it's either going to say right at the bottom in green or wrong at the bottom. In fact, it won't say right in green. It'll say the name of the country in green, or it'll say incorrect in red, and it'll take that button if it's wrong and disable it. If it's right, it's going to have to wait those 2 seconds, then load new flag. And again, that's what he goes into in here. I actually like the way they do things. The only thing I would say about them is sometimes, and this is always a matter of personal taste, I get that, but sometimes these guys, they dwell on stuff that for the life of me, I can't understand why it's important. And then they don't talk about other stuff, and I'm like, my God, why don't you talk about that? I think that's really important. And they'd say, hey, then go write your own books. We're making millions. You're not. Disable buttons, we've already talked about what that's doing, just calling the set enable to false. All right. Setting the fragment class here on the middle of page 176. It extends preference fragment, as it says. It provides capabilities to manage the app's settings. All right. And then the only thing that's left here, 2 things quick. The settings activity class, this is the whole class right there. All right. As it says, it hosts the settings fragment when the app is running in portrait orientation. And then finally, the changes that you have to make to the Android manifest file. And that's it. So in this chapter, he talks about the key thing that he went over were fragments and how to use them. Some of the other things that were discussed, but not as much. And in the next chapter, if you haven't read it already or didn't look at it, that's actually, he builds a game. All right, that's that canon game. And notice what's used in there, multi-threading and frame-by-frame animation. So a lot more animation than what was shown in this particular chapter. Plus, as it says, touch gestures as far as firing the cannon. Hopefully by that time, we will have the wireless, so we'll be able to all come in here and play games. All right? And not have to do it on the emulator. So lab the rest of the period. Lab Thursday, lab all next week. So 2 weeks from today, which is the 2nd or 3rd. I think it's the 3rd. All right. That's when we'll be going over chapter 6. And it's actually a pretty short chapter. All right. So we'll go over that canon game. And again, after the break then, we'll go over chapter 7 and we'll go over chapter 8. Maybe we'll just do it the week we get back. So we do 7 and then a lab, 8, and then a lab, and then we're done. Because then 4 weeks in, so we'd have 5 weeks you'd have for lab at the end of that. That's what I said. What do you mean not do this one? I mean, we can do that, but all it's going to be from now on is going to be whatever program that you're doing for your perpetual program, add these features to it. And I'm just going to pick out the key features. After 6, it'll be the key features in 5 and 6. So from 5, what we just looked at, it'll be some fragments. If you can do some shared preferences, if you can do some simple stuff with animation, etc. In Chapter 6, as it says, all right, working with Canvas. But with some of it, no, it's going to be that program that you decide, the one that you're going to keep working on for the rest of the semester is going to be it's going to be another iteration of that that's going to bring this stuff in. But the advantage of doing that and going over a couple chapters and like that and then doing it, but giving you some time in between, is I just think you need some time to absorb this. I mean, we could spend the rest of before break, we could go over 6, 7, and 8, but I don't think you'd get as much out of it that way doing that. I just don't think it works as well. All right. But like I said, you'll probably still have 5 or 6 weeks, at least 5 weeks at the end of the semester, and just work on this stuff. The advantage too is, I don't know if you heard me say this, that BMI. I told students I want you to have 2 copies of it. I want the one for C#. I said the one without the different rankings, and 3 or 4 people have just turned in one. And they, and it's part of life is being able to listen to directions. And it's amazing the number of people that just did straight copy and paste. And you look at their error messages for their height or their weight, and they say height must be between this. And 3 or 4 people I took off. That I can live with. But when they did their try catch, they copied stuff in and they didn't change it from height to weight. I took off on that. That's wrong. There was a couple of them you couldn't even put a value in. Mike Rates was one of them. And it's not mine. That's not Mike. Yeah, for the C#